The numbers never lie, or do they? Discover how complex economic models, often used as tools of persuasion, are 100% determined by subjective choices. Welcome back to the deep dive. Think about the biggest, most expensive decisions a government makes. We're talking multi-billion-dollar tax reform, deciding whether to fund, say, a massive new high-speed rail line, or greenlighting a really contentious mining project.
These are the big ones, the ones that shape the economy for decades.
Exactly. And when these proposals hit the public debate, they're almost always accompanied by this weighty, detailed economic report.
Right, the big, thick document that lands with a thud.
That's the one. And these reports, they use these incredibly sophisticated economic models loaded with all this input data, and they spit out results with just incredible decimal place precision. The immediate consensus is, well, this is objective, rigorous math.
And that veneer of numerical objectivity is, I think, the most powerful tool of persuasion in modern policy. It really suggests that these complex economic choices have a single verifiable answer that's, derived purely from data.
Which is what we're here to question today.
Precisely. Today, we are taking the model that underpins most of these high-stakes decisions, the Computable General Equilibrium model, or CGE model, and we're going to run a full diagnostic on it.
CGE models they're massive, they're complex, they're expensive to run, and they are absolutely everywhere, from treasury departments to major global consultancies. So for our deep dive, our mission is to peel back the layers of code and the theoretical framework.
And uncover the critical, often invisible assumptions and limitations that fundamentally predetermine the results. We want to show you exactly how the so-called objective math is really built on a foundation of highly subjective human choices.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What exactly are CGE models?
Well, the key term is general equilibrium. And to really understand that, you first have to understand what it isn't. Most basic economic analysis uses something called partial equilibrium models.
Right, and those are the ones focused on just one specific market, like analyzing the impact of a drought on the wheat market or seeing how a rise in the minimum wage affects jobs in the fast food industry. It isolates one thing.
That's it, exactly. They look at a sector in isolation, and they have to assume that everything else is held constant. They're incredibly useful for those microeconomic questions.
But a CGE model is different.
Very different. It's built on the ambition of analyzing the impact of a change, a new tax, a trade shock, a huge infrastructure project on the entire economy, all at the same time.
So it's tracking every single flow-on effect.
Every single one it can.
Yeah.
That tax hike on manufacturing, well, that affects the demand for raw materials, which in turn affects employment in resource states, which then affects housing demand, which affects the import-export balance, and on and on and on.
So it's this whole of economy web, a kind of dizzying matrix of interdependencies.
Yeah.
The versatility must be their main selling point. They can tackle almost any major policy question, which is why they get that jack-of-all-trades reputation.
It is. But that ambition is also their greatest weakness. The moment you try to model everything, every interaction, every price, every single factor of production, you are immediately forced to make assumptions. You have to fill in the gaps for every variable or relationship where you don't have perfect data or where the theory itself is, a bit uncertain.
And this is where the mathematical demand for a neat solution meets the messy reality of, human ignorance.
Precisely. And it's those necessary guesses, those subjective choices that ultimately determine the final result.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the claim we are starting with is absolutely foundational to our whole conversation. CGE model results are, quite literally, 100% determined by the choices made by the modelers.
That's the claim. And I know it sounds contradictory, especially if you believe that math should only have one right answer.
It does. How can math be subjective?
Well, the mathematics of complexity actually dictates this dependency. We can make this tangible with a simple analogy from, say, high school algebra. Remember solving for x. Okay, so if you have a clear solvable equation, like 4 multiplied by x minus 2 equals 10. So 4x minus 2 equals 10.
Right, okay. X has to be 3. 4 times 3 is 12, minus 2 is 10. The equation dictates the answer. It's objective.
Exactly, it's locked in. But now let's introduce a variable we don't know. Let's call it b. Our equation becomes 4x minus 2b equals 10.
Okay, now I can't solve for x. not without knowing B.
And the value of x is now entirely dependent on what arbitrary subjective number you, the modeler, choose for b. If you decide that b equals 1, then x is 3.
Right, but if I choose B equals 2, then 4x minus 4 is 10. So 4x is 14, x is 3.5.
And if you choose b equals 10, x is 7.5. The subjective choice of b dictates the objective solution for x. The math hasn't changed, but the result is now 100% dependent on that input choice you made.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And a CGE model, I'm guessing, has more than just one B.
A CGE model doesn't just have one or two b's. It has thousands, potentially tens of thousands, of these subjective coefficients or elasticities that act as these unconstrained b variables.
And what do these elasticities represent in the real world?
They define all the behavioral relationships in the economy. Things like, how sensitive are consumers to a change in the price of petrol? How much does a rise in corporate tax actually affect investment decisions? How quickly can an industry substitute, say, machinery for workers?
And since there's rarely perfect consensus data on these specific behavioral things, especially when you're trying to predict them over a 20-year timeline, the modeler just has to pick one. They have to choose an assumption that fills the gap.
They have to, and that choice is the single most powerful lever available to the modeler because it fundamentally determines the model's ultimate output. And nowhere is this clearer than in the case study of the Henry Tax Review,
Which was a major foundational document that really shaped Australian fiscal policy for a decade.
a huge deal. And the review's primary recommendation, which was to cut income taxes, was, according to our sources, dictated by a single, unconventional subjective choice about something called labor elasticity.
Okay, so let's break down the default assumption first. What do these models normally assume about labor?
The standard default CGE assumption, particularly the one that aligns with consensus views from central banks like the RBA and national treasuries, is that in the long run, real wages have virtually no effect on the total supply of labor or long-run employment.
Okay, what does that mean in simple terms?
It's known as assuming a labor supply elasticity of 0. Imagine a graph. It's a vertical supply curve.
So if the supply curve for labor is vertical, it means that no matter what you do, whether taxes are high or low, whether real wages are high or low, the total number of people working in the economy stays fixed in the long run.
Correct. It means the economy always adjusts back to something called the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. It's basically the natural rate of unemployment. Essentially, any change in tax policy can redistribute wealth or change industry composition, but it can't fundamentally alter the long-run size of the labor force or, therefore, long-run GDP.
So if the modelers for the Henry Tax Review had used this standard assumption, this vertical supply curve,
They would have been forced to conclude that cutting income taxes, while it might lead to some short-term changes, would yield no long-term economic growth benefit.
they'd have wasted their time. The whole review would have been pointless.
Pretty much. So they made a critical, unconventional choice. Instead of assuming the standard 0 elasticity, they chose a positive long-run labor supply elasticity, specifically 0.2.
So they changed the shape of the graph. They shifted the labor supply curve from being vertical or fixed to being upward sloping or elastic.
Exactly. And the moment they made that single choice, the conclusion was locked in. The final recommendation became mathematically inevitable.
How it's
By assuming an elasticity of 0.2, they built in the idea that if you cut income taxes, after-tax wages go up, and households will react by supplying more labor. Maybe people work longer hours, or more people are drawn into the workforce from home.
So the CGE model, simply following that one input choice, had to conclude that tax cuts would increase the overall labor supply and therefore boost long-run GDP and employment.
It was an input assumption that was just recycled and presented as a policy recommendation.
And that's where the transparency issue becomes so corrosive, isn't it?
Yeah.
The final, high-profile government report provided no discussion, no justification for this single, unconventional assumption. It just presented the model's output as objective truth.
And when you have thousands of equations, the complexity becomes a shield. The public, the politicians, they see this elaborate machinery and the precise numbers, and they assume rigor. They don't realize the entire outcome hinged on that one tiny subjective choice that broke from common practice.
It turns the model from a diagnostic tool into a powerful, custom-built advocacy machine for a predetermined policy outcome.
Let's shift now to some of the specific, really counterintuitive assumptions that are built into CGE models. These aren't just debatable choices. These are structural fictions that are required just to make the complex mathematics solvable.
And I'm curious about the mathematical necessity of these fictions. Why can't they just include more realism? Why do they need these fictions?
Because CGE models are rooted in a very old framework, Walrasian General Equilibrium theory, which was developed mostly before World War II. It's designed to analyze a static economy where all markets clear perfectly all at once.
A perfect harmonious system.
In theory. But when you introduce dynamic uncertainty, things like money or credit or the possibility of people hoarding cash instead of spending it, the system becomes mathematically intractable. You just can't solve for that perfect equilibrium if agents don't know the future or if credit markets can suddenly fail.
So to force a solution, to make the math work, they have to simplify reality down to a system that can actually be solved. Okay, let's start with the first great fiction. There is no money.
It's a big one. Despite the results always being expressed in trillions of dollars added to GDP, the entire financial system is mathematically ignored in most of these models.
How does that even work? How do transactions happen?
The model operates via pure barter. It's conceptual, of course, but households are assumed to trade their labor and their capital services directly for goods and services from firms.
Barter. In the 21st century. That means I can't save currency in a bank account, can I?
Correct. Savings, as we understand them, a stock of money, cannot exist. When a CGE model calculates saving, what it actually means is that the household or the firm is investing in real capital goods.
So instead of putting money in the bank, I'm buying a new machine for a factory.
You're literally delaying your own consumption to buy a new machine or a piece of industrial infrastructure, and then you lease that physical capital back to the productive economy. That's saving in this world.
What are the profound consequences of this structural fiction must be huge.
They're massive. First, the model operates under a strict rule called money neutrality. By definition, things like the money supply, interest rates, credit, and loans have absolutely zero long-run impact on real economic outcomes like GDP, output, or employment.
Wait, so if the Reserve Bank raises interest rates by 5%, the CGE model just shrugs.
It registers no change in the real economy. It only sees a change in relative prices.
But the RBA's interest rate decisions affect real consumption, housing prices, business investment, and ultimately employment. The core mechanism used by governments globally to manage the business cycle is just rendered irrelevant inside the CGE model.
Completely irrelevant. It also means the model cannot factor in crucial real-world phenomena. There's no concept of asset price inflation, house prices, stocks, crypto, or the immense wealth effects that nominal asset inflation creates on consumption.
And
Crucially, the global financial crisis, which was fundamentally a systemic breakdown of credit and finance, is mathematically impossible within the CGE framework. You simply cannot model financial instability.
So if a government wants to assess the impact of taxing wealth or capital gains, the model is inherently incapable of capturing the true dynamics because the entire premise of financial wealth is just ignored. That is a staggering limitation for any modern economy.
Now for the second major fiction, which is required by the assumption of perfect competition, the assumption of zero economic profit.
Okay, let's refresh that. In pure perfect competition theory, companies only earn normal profit, which is just enough to cover their costs and earn a bare minimum rate of return on their capital. If they earn any more than that, what we call supernormal profit, new competitors are supposed to flood the market and drive those excess profits down to zero.
That's the theory. The problem arises when this theoretical framework has to encounter the real-world data that's used to calibrate the model.
The data doesn't match the theory.
Not even close. CGE models are calibrated using national input-output tables from agencies like the ABS, and these tables reflect an economy that's dominated by monopolies, oligopolies, and firms like the Big Four banks or major resource companies that consistently earn vast, persistent, supernormal profits year after year, usually because of regulatory barriers or just sheer market power.
So let me get this straight. The model's cone assumes zero super profit, but the real-world database it ingests is full of super profit.
Yes, and the model has to reconcile this contradiction somehow, so it interprets every single dollar of real profit in the ABS data as normal profit, the absolute minimum necessary return required to keep that capital employed in the country.
This sounds like a recipe for some serious policy distortion. Imagine a government tries to model a tax that specifically targets those entrenched super profits, like Australia's major bank levy.
Exactly. The CGE model cannot recognize that the bank's profits are secured by their market power and their too-big-to-fail regulatory guarantees. It just sees the tax as punishing the minimum necessary return on capital.
And the inevitable model conclusion is what?
Instantaneous massive capital flight. Because the returns are now below the global minimum required, the model predicts the entire banking system will shrink dramatically. It completely ignores the practical reality that those companies are fundamentally regulated and geographically locked to the domestic market.
So the models are structurally biased against any tax on capital. Not because capital is truly perfectly mobile in reality, but because the model assumes capital is only ever earning the bare minimum return necessary to exist here. Any tax is seen as a death penalty for that industry.
What's fascinating here is how these next two required fictions grossly distort our understanding of major economic transitions. They essentially make painful, costly structural change look cheap and instantaneous.
Let's look at assumption 3. Inflation has no real impact. If we're assuming money neutrality, this kind of follows. But let's elaborate on what this assumption really means for policymakers who are worried about the cost of living.
It means CGE models assume inflation is costless and purely a nominal phenomenon. The gold standard for validating a model is something called the homogeneity test. If the modeler raises the overall price level, the CPI, by, say, 10% across the board, the model must confirm that all real economic variables,
Output, employment, real wages, total GDP.
all of them change by exactly zero. If the model fails this test, it's considered theoretically unsound.
So the model is mathematically rigged to ensure that inflation cannot possibly affect the real economy, which means the enormous focus on inflation fighting by central banks all over the world is, within the CGE framework, addressing a non-issue.
It forces a really interesting philosophical question, doesn't it? Are central banks spending trillions of dollars of economic activity fighting an inflation problem that our most prominent economic models say doesn't actually matter?
And the CGE framework ignores key psychological and political realities here.
Absolutely. It ignores what economists call money illusion, the documented phenomenon where individuals, firms, or even governments react to nominal price changes as if they were real changes in value, and that distorts their behavior.
And it completely ignores the political friction.
Mm.
Introducing a new broad-based tax like the GST causes massive price shocks and political upheaval. Inflationary spikes in specific, visible areas like fuel or electricity prices trigger real economic distortion through consumer confidence and political reaction, regardless of what the homogeneity test says about the aggregate average.
So for policymakers who are relying on these models, a CGE result that suggests a policy is good because the resulting inflation is costless is just deeply misleading. It completely ignores the real pain and, frankly, the political impossibility of implementing policies that create rapid price increases for households.
Okay, let's move to assumption 4, which is perhaps the most physically absurd fiction of them all. Perfect capital mobility. This one seems to directly undermine any analysis of major structural shifts, like climate transition or industrial policy.
The absurdity here stems from the data aggregation that's required just to make the model run. Physical capital is typically aggregated into just two types: structures, so buildings, houses, and this gigantic catch-all category of everything else.
And everything else could include a $10 billion LNG export terminal, a high-tech robotic manufacturing plant, a dedicated freight railroad, or a fleet of delivery trucks, all just lumped together.
All lumped together. And the necessary assumption within the CGE code is that these capital types are costlessly and instantly substitutable.
Wait, what?
In the model, it takes zero time and zero effort to convert that multi-billion-dollar LNG export terminal into a solar farm. A coal mine's specialized subterranean infrastructure can be repurposed instantly into a state-of-the-art hospital facility.
That's insane. Supply chain risks can't exist because the means of production can just be transformed instantly to meet shifting demand.
Precisely. So the integrity of major infrastructure decisions is being based on a technical absurdity. If the government uses this model to estimate the cost of moving away from fossil fuels, for example, the model will always underestimate the cost.
Massively, I'd imagine.
Significantly. Firstly, CGE models mathematically struggle with the concept of stranded assets. If an asset becomes economically obsolete, like a coal plant, the model assumes it can simply be repurposed instantly for its next best use at zero cost. Therefore, the trillions in expected stranded asset risk globally due to climate policy simply cannot be accounted for properly in this framework.
And secondly, this perfect malleability, this perfect flexibility,
Yeah.
it distorts tax sensitivity again, right? It reinforces that bias we saw with the zero profit assumption.
It does. Since physical capital is assumed to be as liquid and mobile as financial capital, which, ironically, the model ignores anyway, any tax increase on capital is assumed to trigger a massive, instantaneous capital flight. You can just dismantle that blast furnace and relocate it overseas instantly at no cost.
And this explains the constant, consistent CGE modeling result that taxes on land and labor are economically superior to taxes on capital. Even when reality shows that modern physical capital is often highly immobile and specialized, while labor and business owners are often far more geographically mobile than their physical assets.
That's the core of it. If the model assumes the costless conversion of an LNG plant to a solar farm, how can it ever accurately estimate the risk or the capital costs associated with a genuine energy transition? The entire premise of industrial policy, that specialized capital is expensive and time-consuming to build and retrofit, is rendered completely irrelevant.
So we've established that the underlying code is determined by these subjective choices and some pretty major theoretical fictions. But the manipulation of perception, it doesn't stop there. Part 4, as I understand it, explores how results are manufactured and presented through comparison and some very careful framing to fit a predetermined narrative.
This is the critical stage of presentation. CGE results are never, ever shown in isolation. They are always measured relative to a counterfactual. And that counterfactual is the business as usual, or BAU, scenario.
So the BAU is what the future is predicted to look like without the policy being implemented.
Exactly. The success of the policy is therefore entirely conditional on the perceived doom or glory of the assumed BAU.
And the fundamental difficulty here is what you'd call the prediction problem. Modelers have to make two simultaneous long-term forecasts, the BAU path and the policy path. When economic history shows that economists struggle to predict GDP accurately, even over just 12 months.
The potential for error is just exponential over 20 or 30 years. And if a consulting firm is commissioned to validate a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure investment, their goal is simple: maximize the perceived benefit of that investment. And the easiest way to do that is to set a pessimistic BAU.
You assume that without your project, the economy would have struggled significantly.
Precisely. Let's look at the National Broadband Network, the NBN, as a case study. The public justification for that relied very heavily on CGE modeling. The core question was, what economic benefits does a publicly funded high-speed network actually provide?
And the answer depended entirely on the subjective assumption made about the BAU.
It all came down to this. What internet speeds would private companies have rolled out in capital cities without public funding? If the modelers chose an optimistic BAU, assuming that private companies would have provided fast, cheap fiber in high-density areas anyway,
then the public NBN's benefit would appear minimal or maybe even negative. It would just look like inefficient public spending.
right. So, to inflate the perceived return on investment for the NBN, the modelers often assumed a pessimistic DAU. They assumed the private sector would have been slow, inefficient, and rolled out much slower internet speeds over a much longer period.
So by creating that deliberately sluggish BAU baseline, the model could then claim that the NBN rollout was providing enormous economic benefits over the next 2 decades. Benefits that were purely manufactured by the contrast with that pessimistic counterfactual. The policy looks glorious only because the alternative future was made to look miserable.
And this reveals an even more fundamental limitation, which we can call the success-only bias. Can a CGE model actually model a colossal failure, a real white elephant project?
If the model adheres to its core principles, no.
No, it can't. The entire CGE framework is predicated on the assumption that rational economic agents who have perfect information always act to maximize profits. A rational agent would never undertake a bad investment that loses money or produces goods that nobody wants.
So the process is backwards.
Yeah.
First, the modeler or the consultant assumes the microeconomic success of the project. The Adani mine will sell its coal, the new gas terminal will sell its LNG, the new rail line will be utilized. Then, that assumed success is plugged into the CGE framework just to estimate the macroeconomic flow-on effects.
Therefore, it is mathematically inevitable that the CGE model must predict positive macroeconomic flow-on effects. CGE models are structurally incapable of concluding that a proposed project is bad for the economy. The very fact that a project can be successfully integrated and modeled within this framework means it has already been predetermined to be a winner. It gives the results this false appearance of external validation.
And once that predetermined positive result is achieved, the final stage is all about presentation. This is what you call the multi-unit trick. This is where the difference between the BAU and the policy path is measured using whatever unit creates the most persuasive narrative.
It's astonishingly effective. Let's take a scenario where a policy, say an emissions trading scheme, slows economic growth only very marginally. For instance, 0.77% lower household income growth by 2040 compared to the BAU.
Okay, so I can think of several equally accurate ways to state that result. To minimize the cost, I could say the ETS would slow average household income growth by only 1/20th of 1% per year. That sounds completely trivial.
Exactly. Or, to maximize the perceived loss, you aggregate that tiny annual difference over 20 years, maybe using a zero discount rate, and you announce the ETS would cost households a staggering cumulative loss of income of around $184 billion by 2040.
Both statements are mathematically true representations of the same tiny shift in the growth trajectory, but one is designed to minimize risk, and the other is designed to maximize fear.
It's all in the framing. And the biggest tool of deception here, designed specifically for the non-practitioner, is the job years trick.
This one is classic.
It's a classic example of using cumulative temporary metrics to mask the underlying reality. The ACL Allen gas study, for example, reported an increase of up to 13,611 jobs in the high-visibility executive summary and the press releases. This number sounds enormous and really impactful.
But then you dig into the fine print, and you discover that the 13,611 figure represented temporary job years, meaning one person employed for just 1 year, usually during a short construction phase.
Right. The actual permanent, ongoing jobs created once the project was fully operational were estimated to be only between 82 and 524.
That gap, the difference between 13,000 temporary jobs and 82 permanent jobs, is deliberately masked by presenting the cumulative temporary metric, knowing full well that most policy debates and news headlines focus only on that big, shiny headline figure.
And that technique is only ever used when the real, ongoing job creation is too small to justify the policy on its own. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what we find is that many of these CGE models are actually built on contradictory, sometimes irreconcilable theoretical foundations. The need to generate these comprehensive whole-of-economy results often forces modelers to weld together competing economic theories, leading to a system that is incredibly complex but philosophically inconsistent.
And we noted the clash between the long-run versus the short-run models. They try to model both the immediate shock of a policy and the eventual steady state that the economy settles into.
Yes, CGE models often try to incorporate a short run that is typically Keynesian, so it allows for things like demand shocks, temporary unemployment, business cycles, with a long run that is strictly classical, where the economy settles back into a fixed maximum potential output determined solely by supply-side factors.
And this is where the ultimate subjective choice is hidden, which you call the 3Ps trap. Classical supply-side theory dictates that long-run GDP is determined exclusively by three factors: population, participation, and productivity.
And that is the crucial insight. Long-run GDP is the product of those three Ps. But here is the major structural flaw. Literally all three Ps. The assumed rate of population growth, the assumed labor force participation rate, and the assumed rate of productivity growth are subjective, external inputs that are chosen by the modeler.
Wait, they're not outputs of the model. The model doesn't calculate them.
No, they're not outputs of the CGE model itself. They're simply plugged in at the start.
So the modelers are essentially determining the long-run size of the economy before the model even runs, just by entering their long-term best guesses for population, participation, and productivity.
Absolutely. The thousands of complex equations in the CGE model are really just sophisticated allocation mechanisms. They determine where that predetermined level of GDP lands, which industry benefits, which factor of production receives the income, but they cannot change the total size of the long-run economy. That total size is dictated by those three P input choices.
Which means the modeler holds enormous leverage. If they want to prove that a certain policy leads to massive long-term growth, they just have to assume that the policy marginally increases the participation rate or the productivity rate.
And the model must confirm higher GDP, and the effect is magnified exponentially over time. A subjective choice to increase the assumed annual productivity growth rate by just 0.1%, say, from 1.5% to 1.6% compounds over 30 years to create differences in total GDP with billions or even trillions of dollars.
And that choice is subjective. But the resulting difference in output is massive, and it's all completely hidden inside a single input assumption.
Which brings us back to that core theoretical contradiction we introduced earlier. The NARU conflict. We have models that assume money neutrality, so inflation is irrelevant. Yet they must incorporate the NRU theory, which relies entirely on inflation expectations to function.
Right. How do you resolve that?
Well, NIRU theory suggests that if unemployment dips too low, workers expect higher inflation, they demand higher nominal wages, and that wage pressure forces the central bank to intervene, raising unemployment back to the natural rate where inflation is stable. How do you model a phenomenon that's entirely dependent on inflation inside a model that assumes inflation is costless?
You can't. You have to introduce an arbitrary constraint.
Exactly. The modeler has to use external equations to impose an arbitrary NARU constraint, forcing the model to converge back to a predetermined unemployment rate, irrespective of what the core CGE equations might suggest about labor demand. The model is basically forced to yield the politically acceptable, stable, long-run unemployment rate.
So the long-run results, the predicted size of the economy, the level of employment, are entirely pre-baked through subjective guesses, the three Ps, and these contradictory or theoretical adjustments like the NARU constraint. The complexity just serves to obscure the lack of independence in the final result.
And while some conflicting theory may be unavoidable when you're attempting to simulate an entire modern economy, intentionally misleading users about these critical choices is not. When the complexity of these models serves as a shield against any kind of audit, allowing consultants to profit from results that are predetermined by their clients' preferred inputs, the result is the distortion of public policy and, frankly, the corruption of the policy debate.
This has been a genuinely deep dive into the opaque world of economic modeling. Let's try to synthesize the critical takeaways for you, the learner, to carry forward into the next big policy debate you encounter.
First, I think, is just to understand that CGE models are these complex, expensive tools that are used widely to justify every major policy decision. They provide that numerical cover that gives political action a sense of authority.
Second, despite all their sophistication and their decimal place precision, you have to remember that their results are 100% determined by the subjective and often unconventional choices made by the modelers. A single input choice, like that .2 labor elasticity in the Henry Tax Review, can completely dictate the final policy recommendation.
Third, to even function, these models rely on massive, necessary theoretical fictions. They have to assume money doesn't exist, which means no GFC, no asset price effects. They assume companies make zero supernormal profits and that physical capital is instantly and costlessly convertible and can be relocated globally.
And finally, always question the context. The results are so easily manipulated through their presentation, using temporary job years instead of permanent employment figures, and through the critical choice of the reference case, making that business-as-usual scenario look purposefully pessimistic just to inflate the perceived benefit of the policy.
Applied CGE models, when they're utilized transparently, can provide some valuable numerical estimates for policy consequences. They can be useful, but their power demands a full awareness of their fundamental limitations. When they are used to deceive non-practitioners, they prioritize persuasion over truth, and they inherently distort policy outcomes toward the interests of those who commission the report.
So, since the long-term predictions of GDP, the future health of our entire economy, are entirely determined by the modeler's subjective guesses about population, participation, and productivity, we have to leave you with a final, provocative thought. What political or ideological biases might be unintentionally baked into our economic future before the model is even run, simply through the choice of a subjective growth rate for productivity? And how do we ensure the required transparency when the financial incentives are so often stacked against revealing the subjective choices that underpin our most objective-sounding policy advice?